Hi class, today we're starting Unit 5, which is on energy and waste. And the first system that we're going to be covering in this unit is the respiratory system. Now the respiratory system's main function is with energy indirectly, because inside of our cells we have mitochondria that perform cellular respiration, but they do not work very well aerobically without oxygen. So oxygen needs to get there, and the respiratory system is going to get it there for us. Now the respiratory system is also kind of best friends with the circulatory system because they won't be able to do it without it. And so they work together very nicely. So once the oxygen gets into our body, it gets delivered through the circulatory system, gets delivered to our cells. Our cells' mitochondria could use it to make ATP, which powers our bodies. And so that's the main function of the respiratory system. But also, during those processes, we have waste products that are produced, such as carbon dioxide, and so in general, it can transport both gases back and forth in and out of our bodies. The structures that we're going to be focusing on, as you could see, are going to be the nose, the pharynx, which is the throat, the larynx, or the voice box, the trachea, the lungs, and the tubes that lead there, which are called the bronchi, bronchioles, and the alveoli, which are the functional unit that we'll get to. But first, a couple things about the respiratory tract, or those respiratory pathways that I just mentioned. One of their big things that they need to do is, as air is coming into your body, those structures need to help purify, clean debris and pollutants out of the air that you're breathing in. The air that you breathe in is fairly cold and dry, and so your body needs to warm it up and humidify it. And all those passageways on the way down to your lungs have mucous membranes and cilia and hairs to help trap and warm and humidify and purify the air coming in. So the respiratory system is sometimes broken up into two main sections. The top section is called the upper respiratory tract, and the lower section is the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract starts pretty much at your nose and goes down to the back of your throat, right above your larynx or voice box. And then from your larynx or voice box down to your lungs is going to be the lower respiratory tract. And we're going to talk about each one of these structures. So first, in the upper respiratory tract is the nose, or in general, the nasal cavity. And this is where it all starts. So as you breathe in, air is going to enter your nostrils or your nares. And what's going to happen is in your nasal cavity, you have mucous membranes that are lined with actual hairs and special cells with cilia on them, and they're going to be able to warm and moisten and clean and filter and trap particles as they're coming into your body. A lot of times, some people are susceptible to nosebleeds, and the mucous membrane of your nasal cavity is very thin and delicate, so it could be the blood vessels and capillaries that go to that area can easily be damaged, which could cause a nosebleed to occur. And with it getting colder outside now, you're going to get sometimes runny noses as you go inside and outside or change temperatures. Now, runny nose, again, you're outside, it's really cold, you come inside and it's warm again, and you have that runny nose, and that's because those cilia that line the cavity tend to be a little sluggish. They tend to kind of move backwards and sweep that mucus back down your throat, and then you just swallow it, and you probably don't even know, or you could spit it out. But what happens is that those cilia become sluggish with temperature changes, and it doesn't sweep the mucus back, so then it drills down your nose instead. So in this picture down here, we could see an example of what the cells would look like in your nasal cavity. And so here's those cells, and here's the cilia on those mucus cells, and they're going to be trapping different pathogens, bacteria or viruses, or even just particles that are pollutants in the air. And the special cells kind of in that mucus, you have special white blood cells that are going to take care of it before it actually gets too far. Remember, we just came from the immune system. That's your first line of defense, those barrier methods with mucous membranes. The next part of the upper respiratory tract are the palates. You have two, the hard and the soft. The hard palate is the roof of your mouth. So if you put your tongue up there, that is your hard palate, and it's hard because it's made mainly from bone, mainly your maxilla bone, and part of another bone called the palatine bone, which we didn't learn about in the skeletal system. And the other thing is that the hard palate will eventually transition back into a soft, muscular, glandular tissue called the soft palate. And it ends in a little dangling piece called the uvula that I more specifically call that little hangy thing in the back of your throat when you look in there. And its purpose, it does have a purpose, is that it acts as a flap when you swallow so food doesn't go up into your nasal cavity or liquids don't go up into your nasal cavity and out your nose. And those are the main purposes of your palates. Also, they help with speaking as you're talking as well. Sometimes during development, there's actually many reasons why a cleft palate can occur throughout development. We're not going to go into all those reasons, but they occur sometimes. And what happens is they don't form correctly, and so it leaves a gap, and the nasal and the oral cavities kind of are combined. And so these people, which are usually children, they'll eventually get surgery to fix it, but they will have trouble eating and talking and breathing, and they'll kind of have a few different problems until it's surgically repaired. The next part of the respiratory tract that I need to talk about is kind of an area that's connected to the nasal cavity, which are your sinuses. They're called paranasal sinuses because they're on the side of where your nasal cavity is. These are kind of hollowed areas in your skull bones, and they're named based on what bone of the skull that they're located in. So you have a frontal, an ethmoid, a sphenoid, and a maxillary sinus. And it's kind of lightens up the skull, and because it's kind of hollow, it could also amplify sound when you're talking. That's kind of why you don't, if you ever record yourself, the way that you hear yourself is different than the way you sound towards other people. It's mainly because of these sinuses. But they're lined with mucous membranes, and they will drain and make the mucus that drains down ducts into your nasal cavity. Sometimes those ducts get blocked, and people will develop a sinus headache, or they'll become infected with sinusitis or a sinus infection, and you'll get all that pressure in the front of your face in those sinuses. The next part of the upper respiratory tract and the last part is the pharynx. The pharynx is more commonly known as the throat, and it's only about 5 inches long, but it is separated into 3 separate sections. So the part that's closest to the nasal cavity is called the nasopharynx. The part that's closest to your oral cavity or your mouth is the oropharynx, and the part that's closest to your larynx, which is the next part down, is called your laryngopharynx. But either way, they're highlighted in that picture. That's your entire pharynx, and it's going to be connected to your nasal cavity, and you're going to have that different tissue, those lymphatic nodules, those tonsils that we talked about, the adenoids, and a few other ones that are going to be part of your immune system and kind of trap and get rid of invaders because there are lymphocytes within those tissues. So looking at the upper respiratory tract again, so there's our nasal cavity, and so air is going to go into our nostrils or our nares. We have the hard and soft palates that separate the nasal cavity from the oral cavity, and here's the uvula, which is the dangly thing in your throat that separates the two, and we have some tonsils around here in some different areas that help with immunity. And then once we're past this point, right about here, we're going to go down and go to the larynx, which starts the beginning of the lower respiratory tract. So commonly called your voice box, as you breathe in air, it's going to go down your throat or your pharynx, and it's going to be directed to your lungs. So if I go back to one page right here, if you look at this, when you're coming down your throat right here, you have the road diverges. You could either go down this path or go down this path. So this posterior or back path, this is your esophagus. The only stuff that should go down here is food and drink, whereas the front or the anterior part is going to be your trachea that leads down to your lungs. So as you're breathing and air comes in, you need to make sure that the air is going down the right pipe, so to speak, and not the wrong pipe. If air is going down here, you may be burping a little bit and have some gas that you have to get rid of by belching. And sometimes when you're talking while you're eating, this little flap that we're going to talk about called the epiglottis controls what direction stuff goes. And if you're talking and eating at the same time, it may become confused and you may start to choke as food goes down your trachea instead of your esophagus. So that epiglottis that I just showed you, so this is that flap of tissue that prevents stuff from going down the wrong pipe. And so as you swallow, what will happen is that it will tip over the trachea to prevent food and drink that you swallowed going down into your lungs. And if it does, you start to cough it up and start to choke a little bit. Now you also have vocal cords, because this is your voice box, your larynx. And if we zoom in on the vocal cords right here, they're membranous and elastic flaps, and these called cords. And as air goes down them and past them into your trachea and lungs, they kind of flap in the breeze. And as they start to vibrate and flap, they create sound. And that's why we can't talk. Now, voices typically change. This tissue is affected during puberty, especially in males with testosterone, and the tissue kind of changes and the elasticity changes, and voices change usually during puberty. Now, your larynx is covered up by thyroid cartilage, and that thyroid cartilage is usually referred to the Adam's apple, especially in men, because it's more pronounced and it kind of sticks out in the front. And that's mainly because of testosterone again. And again, I also mentioned that if you start to cough, that means you're trying to get stuff out of your lungs that shouldn't be there. And one of the cool things is that you could actually feel your epiglottis working. So if you put your fingers gently where your larynx or voice box or Adam's apple is, and you swallow, you could actually feel the epiglottis tip up. And when it tips, that's when it's actually covering up the trachea, so the food that you swallowed goes down the esophagus instead. So once the air goes past the larynx and into the trachea is simply the windpipe. And it's not as long as people think. It's only about 4 inches long, and then it starts to branch. Now, the trachea is lined with special cells that have cilia on them, and these ciliated cells also produce mucus and have cilia, and again, they're trying to trap and warm the air before it reaches the delicate tissue and cells further down in the lung tissue. The trachea is kind of designed like a vacuum hose. So think of your vacuum hose, how it has these rings, and that's because as you're vacuuming, it creates negative pressure and will cause that tube to collapse on itself. And so there has to be these thick rings that prevent it from collapsing from the pressure. And your trachea has these thick cartilaginous rings around, they're shown in blue in the picture, to prevent it from collapsing on itself when you're breathing. Now, sometimes there could be a blockage in your trachea or above your trachea, and if it's above your larynx and trachea that you have this blockage and you can't breathe, a medical person may have to perform a tracheostomy where they cut a small hole right below your larynx directly into your trachea and put a tube so you could actually breathe. So this is just a close-up picture of those cartilaginous rings around the trachea, and then the trachea will eventually split to your left and right lung, and those splits are called the bronchi. So the bronchi, there's a left and right bronchus, is singular, and they're just going to go to the lungs. Those bronchi quickly branch into smaller bronchi called secondary bronchi. Those are primary. And then secondary, the secondary ones go to each of the lungs. So here's the primary one, and here's the secondary ones. There's 3 lobes on the right lung, and so the secondary bronchus for each, there's a secondary bronchus for each one. And on the left lung, there's only 2 lobes, and so you can see that there's the secondary bronchus feeding those lungs with air as well. But each secondary bronchi split into tertiary bronchi, and then those branch into smaller ones called bronchioles. And the bronchioles are the smallest passageways. The bronchi branch into tiny bronchioles, which then lead to a part called the alveoli. And that's where all the fun is going to happen. So all this branching creates a tree-like network, and the tree-like network is called the respiratory or the bronchial tree. A lot of people think of the lungs as some sort of hollow containers in your chest that fill up with air, kind of like a balloon. They're more actually sponge-like in structure. And that's because of all the alveoli. The alveoli they look like little tiny clusters of grapes, and each singular one is called an alveolus. And these tiny air sacs are called the functional unit of the respiratory system because this is where the exchange of gas actually occurs. They're incredibly thin with the cells that form them and the tissues that form them, and they're very elastic too, so they could expand and contract with breathing, just kind of like a tiny balloon. Now they're going to be surrounded by capillaries, which are shown in purple, and those purple capillaries we learned about, they're called the pulmonary capillaries, where the gas exchange is going to occur. And then the pulmonary capillaries kind of, again, lead to the pulmonary veins or the arteries, depending on what direction you're going. So this is a zoomed-in picture showing that sponge-like nature. This is all the alveoli, and under an electron microscope, and you could see how the bronchioles branch down into the alveoli. And these sac-like compartments are going to fill with air, and the gases are going to exchange between the blood and the respiratory system here. And this is just a picture of that happening. So we have one alveolus, and you could see that the red is representing the capillaries, and there's some special cells in here that are macrophages to make sure they get any pathogens that are coming in. But if we zoom in on the walls of the pulmonary capillary and the alveolus, you could see how thin they are, and you're going to have that gas exchange between them via diffusion, simple diffusion. So when that gas exchange occurs, well, gas exchange is really just making sure that you're inhaling and then exhaling. So inhalation or inhaling, you're going to take in 21% oxygen. So the air that you breathe in, well, the air in the atmosphere, as you may know, is about 78% nitrogen gas, and it's about 21% oxygen gas, and the other percent is a bunch of random other gases, such as carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is 0.04% of the air that's out in front of you right now. And the air that's in front of you that you're breathing in is 21% oxygen, and that's what's going into your lungs. But your lungs only remove about 25% of it as you breathe in and exchange it into the blood. And so that means when you exhale, that only 15% of what comes out still is oxygen, and 4% of what comes out is carbon dioxide. So the percentages change. A lot of people think that when you breathe out, it's all carbon dioxide. It's not. It's 78% nitrogen coming in, 78% nitrogen going out. 21% oxygen coming in, 15% oxygen coming out. 0.04% carbon dioxide coming in, 4% carbon dioxide coming out. And so carbon dioxide increases by 100% when you breathe out. And there's still plenty of oxygen in the stuff that you're breathing out, which is why something like CPR would be beneficial and works to help save somebody's life. So the gas exchange happens at the alveoli between the pulmonary capillaries. And so when we look and see how that actually happens, when it gets into the blood, then what happens? So once the O2 diffuses in, it actually attaches to hemoglobin, which we already talked about. Hemoglobin is the protein found in red blood cells that contains iron, and iron could grab onto the oxygen and carry it through the blood to where it needs to go. And carbon dioxide should be leaving, and most of the carbon dioxide is actually dissolved in your blood plasma as a molecule called carbonic acid. Now, some of it can bind to hemoglobin, but most of it is going to be dissolved in the blood plasma as carbonic acid. And even though that we're not going into the details of this, because there's some biochemistry into this that we're not looking at, but let's take a look at oxygen. So here's oxygen in the lungs. And when it diffuses into your blood cells, particularly your red blood cells, hemoglobin grabs onto it. And then it travels through your blood. And when it gets to your tissues, it will diffuse into your tissues, and as hemoglobin will release it. Well, the carbon dioxide that your cells in your body produce diffuse into your capillaries, and it dissolves as carbonic acid within the blood plasma. And then it gets carried back to the lungs right over here, where then it breaks it down from carbonic acid and releases it, and the carbon dioxide diffuses back into your alveoli, in which you breathe out. So hopefully that makes sense without going into all the details. All this breathing, the air coming in and going out, it's actually controlled mainly by your diaphragm. Your lungs are not contracting and relaxing. Your diaphragm and some rib muscles are doing that contraction and relaxation. And it's also, those things are controlled by your brainstem, particularly the medulla oblongata, which is going to be part of your autonomic nervous system because it's an automatic thing, you breathing. So they're controlled by those three things as air enters and exits. So your chest cavity is called your thoracic cavity, and there's a membrane around it that seals it and creates a vacuum, which means only air could get in and out of one area, and that's your mouth and nose. So what happens when you're breathing, when you're inhaling and exhaling, is that your ribs and your diaphragm are doing pretty much all the work. Your rib and diaphragm muscles contract and they actually flatten, and usually your diaphragm's arched, but they flatten when you're inhaling, and that creates more volume to bring in and pull in the air. And then when you breathe out, the rib muscles and the diaphragm relax, and the diaphragm kind of pushes up into an arc, pushing against that sealed cavity, decreasing the volume and pushing out the air. So to help you understand that, I have this thing that cost way too much money that I could have built on my own, but this is a kind of a sealed cavity, this plastic thing. And the stopper on the top of it has a hole in it that represents your airway. And the balloons represent your lungs. And this membrane on the bottom represents your diaphragm. So when your diaphragm is contract, it creates less volume in this area, and it creates pressure that pushes out the air and deflates the lungs, in essence. There's always residual air in your lungs. All the air never leaves. And then when it contracts, your diaphragm, and it comes down, it actually creates more increases of volume, and it helps pull in air, and the lungs inflate. So relaxation, exhaling, inhalation, contracting and breathing in. So hopefully that you could see that, and that makes sense. So overall, that is your respiratory system, the parts of the respiratory system, and how you're able to get the gases to and from your cells. And hopefully that was helpful. Thanks.